Why move away from Kiev, which it was so intent on capturing, and of course has huge symbolic meaning, and focus on the east?
Well, in a word, they've been defeated in Kiev. I think we can talk in terms of victory and defeat here. I think the Russian assault was very much focused on Kiev when it began on February the 24th, and in the first days of the attack. But and Russia threw many of its best units, many of its best regiments at Kiev. We saw paratroopers, special forces, elite tank regiments sent at Kiev. And they basically stalled and suffered very, very heavy losses. So, we're talking about Russian losses at this stage are not 100% clear. There's a lot of debate over it, but the numbers are big. I think no one disputes that. It could be 10,000, it could be high 15,000. A lot of those have taken place around Kiev. So they've taken a heavy hammering there, and also I think come to the conclusion they're not going to be able to take the city.
Well, but it's not clear that everyone buys that, right? Because the White House is saying that U.S. intelligence have determined that Putin is being misinformed by his advisors about Russia's poor showing in Ukraine so far. So Putin might think otherwise, even though we've just heard from you about how Russia has taken these heavy losses. How do you interpret that scenario that Putin is being misadvised, misinformed by his advisors?
Well, I think that's very credible. Frankly speaking, I think Putin has been, Putin is a dictator. He lives in a very isolated information world. He's famously not digitally literate. He doesn't use social media. He doesn't have a smartphone. He doesn't navigate the internet very well. He receives his information directly from a very small group of people. And that group has got even smaller over the last few years. He's gone into a kind of COVID cave, a COVID isolation, and now in recent months, even more so because of the war, the build up to the war and the war itself. So I think it's very likely that he is getting a lot of information from so-called yes men who are telling him what he wants to hear. The whole invasion was based on premises that were false, that Ukraine would the Ukrainians would welcome the Russian forces, which frankly speaking, anyone who knows Ukraine knows that was absolutely absurd. But it seems that a lot of Russians, and particularly Putin and those close to him, did genuinely believe it.
So that's an interesting scenario that you paint for us here. Given all that, how important is it to maintain a dialogue with Putin the way that Emmanuel Macron of France is doing, as opposed to President Biden's approach of basically calling out Putin and all but endorsing regime change in his comments? Some would argue he is endorsing that.
Well, I think it was fairly explicit with his comments that this man must not remain in power. I think it's a difficult question on the value of actually engaging with Putin at this stage. He does seem to have become fairly detached from all reality. Of course, the fear is that he'll become totally detached, and there's no knowing what he will do at that point. So you've got the argument that Macron uses, certainly, that we need to maintain a dialogue. Germany also is very insistent on maintaining channels of communication. I believe actually we need to be very strong, and the only language that Putin really understands is strength at the end of the day, and that needs what needs to be shown. And the strength in this context means much tougher sanctions and especially arming Ukraine with much more weapons and much more weapons that will allow Ukraine to actually launch serious military offensives. So far, Ukraine's been armed largely with weapons to mount an insurgency. What they need is weapons to win a war, artillery, tanks, etc.
So how much do you think Macron's insistence on not triggering Putin with talk of regime change is tied to all of Europe's reliance on Russian gas exports and not disrupting that, not having that be dictated to them in rubles instead of euros?
Well, I think the European position in general has always been very, very cautious towards Russia. They've been very, very reluctant to enter in confrontations with Russia. I think Europeans see the bigger picture also in geopolitical terms, that they don't want to be simply seen as following America and following America's lead everywhere. That often leads them to think that they need somehow to maintain Russia's strength and Russia's position geopolitically as a counterweight to America. That's something you often hear from European politicians. So they're reluctant to go too hard on Russia. But I think at this point, it's getting to the stage where even the likes of Macron, even the likes of France and Germany, who have been arch appeasers, are coming to the point where they recognize, you know what, we've got to get tough because this has gone beyond all reasonable levels, and Putin now has to be reined in.
I want to ask you about peace talks, the peace talks taking place in Turkey, because one Russian official has said that there's been no headway made. Another Russian official has said that talks are constructive. Which is it? And is this some form of intentional misinformation, or is it a reflection of just how confusing and conflicting everything is inside Russia?
I'd be inclined to think, I'd be inclined to presume or assume that the latter, to be honest. I think there's a lot of, I think it's quite clear at this point that a lot of Russians in senior positions, including Foreign Minister Lavrov and many other senior officials and representatives of the Kremlin, didn't actually know that the invasion was going to happen on February 24th until it did. I think that there was a very small circle who were aware of that. And so I think when you get situations, as you say, like yesterday, where you're getting mixed messages, where you're hearing, oh, great talks, no progress, maybe there really is a lack of information between them. Speaking of the peace talks in particular, I think there is skepticism. Again, there are concerns in Ukraine and in a lot of European capitals, and I believe in America also, that these talks are being used by Russia in order to create the illusion that there is progress towards peace, because obviously that allows Moscow then to say, well, you know what? Let's not arm Ukraine. Let's not impose more sanctions, because we need to move towards de-escalation to have peace. So they're trying to promote the idea that we're closer than we maybe actually are in reality. But all that, the losses that Russia's suffered on the battlefield and the international isolation that Russia is facing are far beyond anything that the Kremlin would have anticipated. So maybe they are moving towards being ready to consider some sort of compromises.
Okay, well, I'll believe it when I see it. We know that President Biden has pledged $500 million in U.S. aid, direct U.S. aid to Ukraine. What is the best use of those resources? And do you see it moving the needle on the conflict in any way?
I mean, I think that's not enough, frankly. I know it sounds very ungrateful. It might sound very demanding, but I think we need to talk about much bigger numbers. We need to talk about much bigger amounts of aid, as I mentioned just briefly previously. We need to arm Ukraine to win. Ukraine at this stage has outfought the Russians at almost every stage of the battle, but they've been fighting essentially with the tools with tools for an insurgency, with handheld tools, with rocket anti-tank missiles and stingers and the kind of things that were given to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. They need the equipment to win a conventional war. And if we give them the tools, they can finish the job. They can do it. And that would have sounded, frankly, just fantastical 6 weeks ago. But now, after what we've seen over the last 5 weeks of this war, I think it's actually now realistic to think that Ukraine has a chance of inflicting a defeat on Russia.